Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending the first of our 2022 lecture series here at the Old Manassas Courthouse. It's an annual series that's put on by the Office of Historic Preservation. We're a division within Prince William County's Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, I'd encourage you to, on your way, well, the talk is over, on your way out the doors, check out our little panel of information. We currently manage 12 different historic sites throughout Prince William County that range from all sorts of different eras of history from the time of the American Revolution, even before then, up until even more modern day sites. My name is Kevin Pollock. I'm site manager of Ben Lomond Historic Site here in Manassas and Bristow Station Battlefield. I'd also encourage you as well, when you make your way outside, we have plenty of events going on, both in-person and virtual events. And tonight's going to be one of those hybrid events where we have a little bit of both happening, but we do have plenty of events coming up in the next few months, so I'd encourage you to pick up any of our event flyers that are out at the table out there. Just a couple of things that I'll highlight for everybody. If you're into history talks with a more formal setting like this or a more informal setting, we'll be doing our Take a Sip of History, focusing on stories of Prince William County military veterans from the French and Indian War until more modern conflicts, and that will be done in partnership with Tin Cannon Brewing Company out in Gainesville, and that will be on the night of March 2nd. And then back here in the Old Manassas Courthouse on March 26th, we'll have our annual Prince William County History Symposium. And again, we have plenty more information out there available on the tables. While tonight's program is free, we certainly do appreciate any donations that anybody might be able to offer. You're not required to, but we do appreciate it to help further our goals of preservation, interpretation, and restoration of our historic sites. And there's a box out by the table out there as well. And then real quick before we get into tonight's program, as I mentioned, this is just the first of our annual lecture series. And so the next program in this series is going to be another Thursday night. It's always the fourth Thursday every month, and that is February 24th at 7 p.m., where we will have author Michael Brantley presenting about his new book called Galvanize, the Odyssey of a Reluctant Carolina Confederate, where Michael will be talking about his ancestor, who served in the North Carolina unit during the Civil War and was actually captured just a few miles away from here at Bristow Station in October of 1863. Before we get into tonight's program, one other thing that I will mention, we do have restrooms up here in case anybody does need them. They are directly behind me basically, but because Ross, our speaker, is going to be standing here, we'll just ask you to go through that open door. You can take a right and you'll see signs for a restroom, again, pretty much directly behind me. But I'm going to go ahead and bring up our speaker and introduce Ross. Ross Schwalm is a compatriot in the Sons of the American Revolution through his fourth great-grandfather, Adam Lebo, I hope I pronounced that right, Continental Militiaman in 1779. He's also the third great-grandson of Ross Schwalm, a Hessian soldier captured at the Battle of Trenton. This gives him a unique perspective as a historian who can walk in the footsteps of his ancestors to cover both sides of the American Revolution. Mr. Schwalm is the current president of the Ross Schwalm Historical Association and the Colonel William Grayson chapter of the Virginia Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. He's a retired United States Marine Corps artillery officer with combat service during Desert Storm as a headquarters battery commander. He's been a contractor performing analytical and systems engineering duties for 20 years with the military services, and thankfully he's local to us here in Prince William County, residing in Woodbridge with his wife Carol. And tonight he is going to present to us about Hessian prisoners in Dumfries, Virginia in 1777. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ross Schwalm.
Sorry for the brief operational pause, but I also had to get sworn in tonight as Senior Vice Commander of the Irish Brigade Camp, Sons of Union Veterans. So,
it's a busy man.
Yes, and
plus you had to knock down a few shots.
Right? Yeah. There you go. Irishman.
Yeah.
I had to open my Bible and swear in. I'll move it on. Check. Everybody good? Cool. Think about this for a second. 245 years ago tonight, actually this week, the revolution came in a physical presence to Dumfries with some Hessian prisoners that were actually captured at Trenton. I mean, when I thought about that, and they asked me to do this brief, I said, well, it's the same week as the 245 years ago, right? So in January of 1777, some officers and their aides showed up in Dumfries to be guarded as prisoners of war. Very fascinating kind of thing. Anyway, so moving on here to the next slide. Full disclosure, right? I like to tell people a couple of things. Number one, myself and the biases I may or may not have or try to get rid of as a historian. My third great grandfather was Ross Schwalm. He was in the Kniephausen regiment, and he was actually came here in America. We'll talk a little bit about a favorite period of history called Hessians Victorious, right? You know, we always hear about the Hessians, you know, getting captured at Trenton or at Saratoga, but I like to do a piece called Hessians Victorious. They were pretty good up until that point, until Trenton. So he ended up being a prisoner of war in Lancaster, but all but one of his officers was shipped to Dumfries. So it's kind of interesting. They separated the officers from the enlisted men intentionally. Well, he was unlucky enough to be exchanged, and on his way back to New York on the ship Trenton, they ran into a storm and got separated from the rest of the British fleet, and he ended up getting captured by privateers. So they hauled him all the way back into Philadelphia, where he had been exchanged, and he spent 4 years in prison in Philadelphia. And it's kind of interesting. When he was in Lancaster, he worked for a local farmer, and he was paid and that farmer sold goods to the Continental Army. While he's in Philadelphia, he was making ammunition for the Continental Army. So it was so I'm trying to prove both of those things in order to get him as recognized as a compatriot in the SAR, because he ended up staying in America, right? And it's kind of interesting. After the war, he went right back to that farmer and kept farming. So I'm also a militiaman, right? You know, my fourth great grandfather, Adam Lebo, his father emigrated from that part of France and occasionally to Germany. They were French Huguenots, you know, Protestants, and when the Catholics became in charge of France, the monarchy, they were kind of like pushed aside and you know, sent to England. And Queen Anne said, "Oh, I got a deal for you people. I have some good land in North America." So that's how they ended up initially New York, and then along the Susquehanna River. They built rafts, and they rafted down the Susquehanna River and ended up in a place called Dauphin, which is just south of Harrisburg, right, in town. And anyway, so he stayed. And what's interesting about him, he only served for 2 months, but that's good enough, right? We all did our part, right? And what's interesting, his descendants fought War of 1812. Like his son was actually at Baltimore in 1814 when the Star Spangled Banner was written, right? So that's kind of cool. And then both Johannes and Adam had Civil War descendants, World War II descendants, Gulf War descendants in my case. And so I like to say we've been fighting and farming for 245 years. So this gives me a very unique perspective to look at, all aspects of it. And I like to get in and look at the footsteps of these guys. And so you'll see a little bit of that tonight. This project was funded by Historic Prince William through a grant. I had a student help me. And then, so we laid out a set of questions we wanted to figure out. And, I want to cover who the Hessians were, where they come from. There's a lot of misunderstanding. I want to try and clear that up for you. How did they actually get to Dumfries, right? We cover that. And then what was the prisoner experience like? So I have that both for what was going on in Lancaster and what was going on in Dumfries. And you'll see kind of unique in the history of warfare. The Americans led the way on how to treat prisoners better than the British were. So, and then how did it end in Dumfries, and then what happened to these guys afterwards? And then a little bit of statistical analysis. You can ask me questions anywhere you want along the way. So we've been publishing on the Hessians ever since 1975. family members got motivated by the book Roots by Alex Haley, and then he is credited with pushing everybody into genealogy, right? It used to just be the rich people that knew who their ancestors were, right? Well, not after Alex Haley. I mean, he opened the door for all of us. And several family members were researching, who was this, did we really come from a Hessian that fought in America? And they were able to pool their notes together and pool their money together and started a nonprofit. And we've had so much information and we brought in so many people that we've been able to publish every year since then. And, we're starting to crank up our 2022 journal. I actually have to call my editor on Monday and go, hey, are we ready to start? So that's kind of neat. But what I noticed was one of the things as the president of the organization, we never really did a comprehensive consolidation of everything we know about the Hessian prisoners in Dumfries. And one of the historians that I work with is Dr. Daniel Krebs. He's a professor at Louisville. He's still in the German army. His ancestor came here, went back to Germany, and he's still in the German army, but he's teaching American history at Louisville. So he's like there. He had like one sentence in his book about Hessian prisoners in Dumfries. He goes, Ross, I just didn't have time to get to that. But anyway, so I said, this is a project I want to do, because I live right near Dumfries. And I thought I would get to it in 22, right? I had kind of laid out a plan, I'll be retired by then, and life's good. No, I went on the tour with Historic Prince William, and they had one slide on prisoners in Dumfries, and I go, hey, I know about those guys. And so the next thing you know, I found a student, and then we did a project. And it all came together basically summer of 2019. So this was my little team here. I was the academic advisor, kind of thing, and I'm trying to become an adjunct professor at the community college, and they're like, but you don't have any masters in history. I go, no, I got way more than that. And so anyway, but George Cotley was a grad student that I met at the Revolutionary War Conference down in Williamsburg in the spring of 2019. He was doing research for another project, and he came through and stopped by to see me, and we had breakfast at the Cracker Barrel on 234, and I said, look, I want to show you Williams Box Museum, at Hessians Victorious. And so we decided to crank up the project. I needed help from Stephen Westfall. He's a volunteer researcher that works with us in Germany, and so he digs into anything. So if you think you have a Hessian ancestor or a German ancestor, he can go into the records over there, and he knows German and figure it out. And we cracked this thing out. It was pretty cool. We started really about March of 20, and then delivered the paper in 21. Huge paper, and then we had to do a briefing, and we got new information about a day before we were going to do the briefing. That map that you saw on the front page was one of the things that we uncovered about a day before we briefed Dave and his gang out there in the thing. So since then, we've uncovered other information, right? Like we could not get to some of the resources. And we put those things together and published them with the help of Bill Backus. Here is volume 3. We had a pretty good article in there, and the county can sell you these if you need one. And then after that, we found even more information, and then we were able to put it together in a journal that was published last year. And what's interesting is that photograph that's on the front cover of the journal. That's Germany in 1938. Okay, 1938. That's in Johannes Schwalm's hometown, right? They're still moving ox carts around. And think about that for a second. In 1938, right? And but my cousin's like, hey, I found this picture. I got a cousin over there who came. We both had the same. Johannes's father is our common ancestor. So my cousins are still over there, and one is a Warnhouse in the German Army, MP, military policeman, and the older one, he's a newspaper reporter and also does history. So he found this, and we put it on the front cover. So it's kind of interesting. We're planning on doing prisoner profiles, basically take each and every one of these prisoners that are in Dumfries, all 49 of them, and doing, over the next few years, laying out profiles. So we're going to start working on that here in about another 2 weeks or so. And then I had a meeting with Rob Orson just a couple weeks ago. He goes, "Hey Ross, look, we got new panels." So he took the information he had and put it up in the Williams Ordinary Conference Room there, which is kind of cool, you know. So we can, that's what I like about history. Once you uncover something, then it's incumbent upon all of us to get out and communicate that. So if you get a chance, go down there and do it. So we put together some research questions. You'll see the ones that are bolded. Those are the ones we were able to answer. Okay, so the bolded questions. You know, how did they get to America? Where did they serve in combat? You know, how did they get to Dumfries? This was a big. How were they transported to Dumfries? Right? We tried to uncover that, which was kind of fun. And you know, did they establish any relationships here? You know, like in Lancaster, right? Everybody. You know, they're like, oh, they're just Germans just like us, right? So it was not a big deal, right? So they were able to, and you know, strike up a better friendly relationship with locals. So was that the same as here, right? This question we asked and tried to find out. How were they paid? You know, did they have jobs in the local community like they did in Lancaster? So, and then what happened after they moved to Winchester when they left here? Well, you can see that one's not bolded. That's an add-on that I got to go and convince somebody in Winchester to help me figure that one out. And I haven't done that yet. And then we also didn't add on, like, okay, what happened to all these guys after they got back to Germany, right? You know, because it's interesting, right? The French, you know, the French Revolution, a lot of Germans, you know, were fighting the French, and what happened to those guys, right? And then did any of them stay in the United States or Canada? And this is important to my organization because if somebody can trace their ancestry, we'll give them a Hessian certificate for $35. You know, as my treasurer says, Ross, we're a non-profit. Doesn't mean we don't make any profit, right? So anyway, but I'm the registrar. I review all the apps, and I just got one now. They started working on it in 1986, and they just uncovered a few things that they're about one document away from finishing the case. So it's kind of neat. And then did any of them desert? And did they stay here in Virginia, right? There were a lot of Germans in Virginia, right? Shenandoah Valley, all that, right? So we found out that one of them did stay. And then this was always a good, did anybody marry any of the local Prince William gals? Well, we were able to figure out that did not happen. They were only here for 4 months, so it just didn't happen. And then what about newspapers, right? Did newspapers cover these guys, right? You know, that's another historical source, right? Yes, there were a couple newspapers used in the report. And then there's some other information up at the Maryland Historical Society. For some reason, records from Prince William County ended up in Maryland, and but we haven't had a chance to get up there and see those. It's still not open, right? It closed in April of 20, and they're still not open yet. So that's in Baltimore. I gotta go and see what else we might be able to find, and any other records. I like to show my cards pretty early. So we had some primary sources, and these sources were really 2 diaries by officers. Both of these officers are actually prisoners in Dumfries, and they kept diaries, right? And those diaries survived all the way to the modern times. And that's the second blue box. The first blue box is the Hessian Trenton prisoners list. Like we tried to identify every prisoner by name and have a consolidated list. We maintain that at JSHA, and we updated it. The most recent update was in 2013. So we started with that list. We called out all the prisoners that went to Dumfries, and that became our basis of starting this project. And then the paymaster, you know, the quartermaster, Matthias Mueller, right? So Lisa Timmerman down at historic Dumfries, she said, well, Ross, the only evidence we have is this one little, there was 2 sentences. She said, this Mueller guy shows up and pays all these guys in June of 77. That was really all she had as information. But we used that to look, and lo and behold, right, Mueller was actually had done a diary too. He'd been paying prisoners all over the place, right? really fascinating read. And my colleague, Henry Ritzer, who's on my board of directors with GSHA, he had actually published some stuff in 2005 with these guys. And he was so happy when I decided to pick up the mantle and keep running with the prisoners. The one person that stayed in Dumfries is called Carl Friedrich Fuhrer, prisoner, patriot, and publisher. He actually started a newspaper in Alexandria, Virginia. And he's buried somewhere here in Dumfries. We're going to try and hunt him down and find out where he's buried. And so Ken Jones did 2 stories on him, and those books were actually in historic Dumfries Library, and they didn't even know that they had them, right? I think so. And there's my friend Daniel Krebs. Wrote his PhD dissertation was a generous and merciful enemy in the life of German prisoners during the American Revolution. And so he's got all kind of really good information, all kind of background on how prisoners were treated. Here, Winchester, Charlottesville, there was a prison. I'm going down there for a visit sometime here in the spring to see that camp, what remains of it. Interesting. So Andreas Wiederholt, his diary was actually digitized by the University of Pennsylvania very recently. It was back right before we were going to publish, and we got wind of this thing. And so if you want to read, 18th century German, have at it, right? But like I said, Bruce Burgoyne actually translated all these, and so we have it in English. But it's kind of neat that this thing popped up out of nowhere. So, who were the Hessians, right? We'll start with that, because there's a lot of people don't quite get that. So Rick Atkinson, I'm sure you know Rick, he was the famous World War II historian, but he's jumped ship now and came back to the Revolution, right? So his first book was called The British Are Coming, and I told him, hey Rick, you had the wrong subtitle on there. They need their Hessian auxiliaries to come with them, and he just laughed. But in the second volume, he's going to actually mention some of the files and sources he used with JSHA. So we'll be hitting his next book, his second book. But in here, it's interesting. In the prologue, it talks about what King George was dealing with. Right, this was like the first global war. This was way beyond anything in Europe or anything that had happened in Asia. I mean, it was everywhere. Right, it was Gibraltar. In Europe a little bit. He had to protect, his interests down in the Caribbean, and, he had won Canada, right, in the French and Indian War, so he's got this big, huge, massive land he's got to protect. So Prime Minister Lord North in September of '74 was like, hey, wait a minute, we're going to need some help, right? The Hessians and the Hanoverians could be employed if necessary, right? So they knew pretty early on they were going to need help. So we fast forward to about a year later, and less than a year later, Lexington and Concord, right? British had to get forced back into Britain, or into Boston, and June 12th, I think General Gage knew what was coming. So he writes this letter to Secretary Ward and he says, things have come to this crisis, we're going to need a lot of help. I mean, he said even the Negroes might come to our aid, right? Hanoverians, Hessians, maybe perhaps the Russians. He was thinking really big. I mean, this is a guy that's trapped in Boston, and he's like, hey, we're going to need a lot of help. Well, he made an estimate that he was going to need about 32,000 troops. Well, lo and behold, about 32,000 Hessians ended up coming to America in support of the war. So it was kind of interesting. He hit that number right on the head, right? The Russians actually turned down the offer, and then so the negotiations with all the principalities in Hesse started in '76, and they cut treaties with these guys.
Did they ever get any people from the Kingdom of Hanover?
Yes. So there were 6 principalities that they were all kind of related to the Hessians. The Hanoverians were actually King George III was the Elector of Hanover. And those guys were all recruited and put right into British regiments. So George Kotlik's actually working on a story now about the Germans it was called the Royal American Regiment. It's kind of, these guys were formed up, and they fought in the French and Indian War. They had 4 battalions of people, and then the 3rd and 4th battalion disseminated or were disbanded. And then when the American Revolution kicked off, they reconstituted the 3rd and 4th battalions, and those were filled mostly by Americans. And so it was kind of interesting. So George is working on that story, and it's kind of interesting how we're going to put that together. And they actually served out in Florida, of all places, right, against the Spanish. And so anyway, but these were called subsidy treaties. In other words, I'm going to give you money. I'm going to subsidize you, Prince, and then you're going to turn around and you're going to give me full units of men. So I need 5 regiments of grenadiers, or I need 5 regiments of musketeers, or I need whatever. And then they would cut a deal on, and each principality cut its own treaty deal. There was a British colonel who went around and was negotiating all these treaties, and everybody's treaty was slightly different, right? So Hesse itself was the biggest group of people, and they ended up getting about 18,000 total numbers. And so we just generally call all of them Hessians, and some of them were Brunswickers, whatever. Occasionally there was a Hanoverian that might come down to escape the British and end up in the army. So we consider those guys as Germans. Right? So it was a pretty simple process. Once the treaty was cut, the prince put together his units and armed them and fitted them and everything. And then it was the British responsibility to actually transport them to where they're going to go and give them all their ammunition, right? And give them food. And so they were really under the command of their German structure, but in America they were under British command. So they were full-blown units. They were not mercenaries. If you want, I can come back and give you my 40-minute thing on why they weren't mercenaries, okay? And if you're ever interested. So how many of you can say that your ancestors actually one of the grievances against King George in the Declaration of Independence? And so, armies of foreign mercenaries, right? Which was, I consider that the Continentals were just misinformed. They just didn't quite know. But anyway, so here's Hesse. Point out. Here's Hesse, right here in the middle of Germany. And you can see that their problem was it's really nice flat farmland there. So guess what? Everybody comes there and invades, right? So they either suffered invasion from the French or whatever, and then from the east it was always, either the Prussians themselves or the Poles or the Czechs or the Austrians. So it was sort of kind of really in a bad spot. So I have not mentioned the Prussians, right? Can anybody tell me why I didn't mention the Prussians? Well, old Frederick the Great was still licking his wounds from the 7 Years' War. So Prussia is right here, and there's a city here that was kind of principal where and they had their own cheer back then. I don't know if you guys knew this or not, but they had a cheer in Prussia. It was, "Let's go, Brandenburg." Let's go, Brandenburg. But anyway, so Brandenburg is right there, and
You'll regret it.
yeah, it was interesting. We stayed out of that. So yeah, they were. It's kind of an interesting thing. I'm rereading Frederick the Great's Art of War right now to understand better how they were trained and everything.
Well, they later had designs on wanting to grab up all those small
Right.
duchies and kingdoms and everything.
Right, and that didn't happen until 100 years later. Yeah, 100 years later, the Prussians became.
My great-grandfather lived in Hanover, when they came in, took all the men, pressed them in the army, served the Kaiser, who they hated.
Yeah. And
he finally deserted in 1871 and got here, but he was 30 by then. That's how he couldn't get out.
Yep. So Hesse, it's kind of interesting, right? Because of the invasions, they put their main castle at their capital in Kassel, their main fortress. Then they had a second fortress in Marburg, which was to kind of support the French from coming in there. But they realized that if I have to evacuate either one of those fortresses, I need something, you know, for them to fall back on. So they built the water fortress Ziegenheim. And Ziegenheim is now a village incorporated in with a small city called Schwalmstadt. So Schwalm City, right? And so it's interesting that they did this. It was also the Hessian archives. So I will show you a picture of the archives. He wanted to protect all the state papers and everything, and it's kind of an interesting thing. So here's the water fortress Ziegenheim. This is a little model they have built over there. I got to go see it and take a picture of it. This is actually stored in a big ammunition bunker over there. They still have this as a model. They have a bigger model in their museum now, which incorporates, it has all the buildings and everything in it. But that's the water fortress Ziegenheim. And the river, that river is the Schwalm River, of all things. That's the Schwalm Valley, and everybody from there is called a Schwalm. But here's a little model that sits out, it sits inside the fortress today. Each wall was set up a different length at a different angle. That was for defensive purposes, right? And then, so they had a granary, right? The granary was this huge building. And then there was a big chow hall right there in the middle. And then you had, this is a parade ground, whoops, back here. There's a parade ground right in here where they all learned how to march. And then the troops were stored over here in these barracks, and then the officers had their own separate barracks. And of course, they were very, very religious, mostly Protestant, mostly Lutheran, and the men would march into church, and they were on the ground floor of the church, and then the officers had a separate entrance, and they were up in the balcony. And there's a pipe organ in there that was put in that church in 1740. And my cousin said something very fascinating to me. He said, Ross, Johannes for the first organ playing. I mean, that's kind of a crazy thing, right? So here's the archives. You can see the archives right here. This is, the walls of that building are probably about 4 feet thick, and they have a massive door on the front of it. And what do you do with a building that's like that, can stay at a set temperature all the time? Well, it's a little wine restaurant now inside. And the Rob, you need to get this job, right? Because the manager of Fortress Ziegenheim is a museum. He actually lives above the winery in the archives, so you need to get that job. You know what I'm saying?
That's perks.
Yeah. So if your name is Schwalm and you show up in Ziegenheim, they give you the special tour. So they took me up and through the belfry behind the organ pipes, and there's a balcony around the steeple. You can get a 360 view of the fortress, and so I took this shot. I mean, to think about Johannes actually training in that parade ground there, kind of fascinating. This is the granary over here, right? This one, that's the granary, and this was the old chow hall, and the archives is just off the screen over here. But very, very fascinating, right? The granary became a women's prison, and they just closed that down in 2013, and converted it back to a historic building. Kind of cool. So, Johannes became a soldier in 1770, and it was kind of, you went and you trained for about 4 to 6, 8 weeks, and then you went back to your farm and did whatever. So you get called out in the spring, train a little. You go back in the summer and then get called out for training like right before harvest season, and then you get sent back to your farm. So they were a pretty organized unit. So he was an experienced soldier by 1776. So his route of march, basically, they walked 223 miles from Ziegenheim all the way up to Bremerley. And then at that point, they had to swear oath of allegiance to King George III, right? To make sure that they understood when they leave who they're actually going to be working for. And then they embarked on the ship Claudina. And we have all these records, which is kind of fascinating. The Royal Navy archives in Britain, you know, they have all these shipbuilder lists and everything. So you can actually figure out if your ancestor actually got to North America and if you ever got back to Germany or not by looking at these records. So, kind of fun. And, you know, I like to map everything out just to get an idea. But like Johannes' hometown, there's this little place called Wilhelmshaven, right here on the little star there. I've been to that village and stood by the Schwalm River right there, took my picture. So off they went. So what did they do before Trenton? This was kind of give you, I like to put things in context. Well, my ancestor made the landing on Long Island, August of 1776, right? The British had, they were the greatest navy in the world at that point. They were experts at amphibious operations, and they made this landing, and the Continentals decided, well, we're not going to oppose the landing. So they stood, they built their defenses behind a hill there on Long Island, and well, they left a gap in the line, and the Hessians were able to figure out that, the Jaegers, which were the recon guys, figured out they found the gap, and William Howe went around and rolled up the whole thing. 2,600 captured British Continentals, and then they stopped because they sued for peace, right? They tried to say, hey, look, we can go wherever we want, whenever we want, So we really just want to settle this dispute. And the sticking point is the Declaration of Independence. The negotiators would not give up on that. So off we went, right? There's nothing left to do but fight it out, as Howe's chief of staff said. And so they fought their way all the way through, New York and New Jersey. They ended up in Trenton. Okay, well, nobody fights in the winter, right? Unless you're the Prussians. And so they went into winter quarters in Trenton, about 1,500 Hessians. And that was a defensive force of the Regiment Rahl, von Mossberg, and the von Niephausen outfit. And, well, the story, right? They crossed the river and they got captured. So it was fairly, 1,500 versus 2,400. Kind of an interesting fight. But they captured about 1,000. And, the remnants of that regiment, of those 3 regiments that got away, ended up becoming a combined regiment. They reformed it into a single regiment for about 2 years until these guys were exchanged back. Kind of interesting tidbit. So of the 1,000 that were captured, 49 of them were sent to Dumfries, Virginia. And we know that by the research and what's going on. So that was the basis of our thing.
Why only 49?
Why only 49? There were 28 officers. One of those officers ended up being sent to Lancaster. The other 27, one was wounded. They left him in Trenton and let the British deal with him. And then the others came here to Dumfries. And they brought along basically their servants, right? Officers had servants. And so it's only 49. They said, well, officers can't really do anything. Yes,
Well, it seems like there are a lot of other Hessians floating around somewhere. If they only brought in 49.
Right.
Those are just officers?
Yeah, so 27 were officers and those were enlisted. So they were things like, they said they were like laborers or servants or something like that.
But they actually fighting troops somewhere else.
Yeah, the rest of them all went to Lancaster, including my third great grandfather, right? They marched to Lancaster. And,
Okay.
yeah. So what's interesting is the first problem they had was that they had to get all these guys back across the Delaware River. Well, unfortunately, the Continental got into the rum stores that the Hessians had and got, celebrated their victory. And now they're all drunk and they got to get back across the river. And so it was kind of interesting. So they made it back across. And their first stop was in Newtown. And this is where they first separated out the officers. So, this is kind of standard practice today, right? We separate the officers from their men. 2 reasons, really, why we do that. We do it I did it in Desert Storm, right? Is one, you don't want the officers try to have some overdue influence on their men. And second of all, if the men don't really like this guy because he got us captured, his life would be in danger. And of course, officers were very valuable, right? If you're gonna do exchanges,
Mm-hmm.
right? If I have 27 of these Hessian guys and I can protect them, I can exchange them for Continental officers. And so they became very valuable assets. So don't get them hurt by putting them in the thermal troops. So this is another reason that this works out. So what's interesting is they actually had dinner with General Washington, and Wiederholt and Lieutenant Peel both were like, well, he's not really that big of a guy. He's not really that, it's not, yes, he smiles and everybody seems to respect him, but it wasn't like, they thought he was bigger than life, right? It's like we always thought, well, Romulus is just, God of warfare. They're just average people, right? In the end of the day, they just happen to be in charge. And so it was interesting that they came to that conclusion, and they wrote about it in their diary, right?
Now, did they speak English, or did they go through
And
translation?
it's interesting, there were a lot of Germans, and they were rather tall and American, and Washington actually had, like, his personal guard were some of these bigger, taller Germans that were in Pennsylvania and whatever. So, yeah, so they had, as I like to say when I was in Denmark, between her broken English and my broken German, she hooked us up with some really good coffee. Right? So, that's what, and so everybody knew each other, right? We had Hessians in America in French and Indian War, right? So yes, and there were a lot of Germans, and yes, so that's how it worked. The dinner, they had dinner together, and then it's an interesting, what happened after that, they went through Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia is still not the city of brotherly love, okay? And it wasn't back then either. So as the Hessian troops were marched through town, the officers were in covered wagons, and everything from rotten tomatoes and feces and everything else were thrown into prisons. The prisoners were really scared about their lives and everything. You see that pretty quick, the picture that they have down in it's like, oh, we're marching through Philadelphia. It wasn't exactly that way. It wasn't
Running the gauntlet.
right? So, Romanesque, right? We take the prisoners of the Old Victor and put them through there, right? So the Hessian soldiers were marched off to Lancaster with one officer, and they needed somebody to translate between the commandant, right, so to speak, and the rest of it. So here you go, the 5 January they took off to Lancaster, and then the others, the officers and everything, they left Philadelphia and started heading south. And they ended up in Baltimore about 11 days later, right? So we were trying to uncover how did they actually do this. And there were some wagons to haul their stuff, but most of it they walked. And, they had billets along the way. And so I actually, traced all this out to figure out, okay, over the course of 2 days, they walked 34 miles, right? Okay, 15 miles a day. If you're supported by wagons, probably could do it, right? Even officers. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that so the Continental Congress had problems right from day one with the states in terms of who's really in charge of the prisoners. So the Continental Congress finally got to the point, said, no, we're going to be the lead agency because they wanted to be the ones trading and exchanging these officers. So they took charge of that. And and by the way, they evacuated Philadelphia and came to Baltimore too. The Congress was set up in Baltimore. And they had a resolution that we're going to send these Hessian prisoners to Dumfries. Well, one of my colleagues is like, well, Ross, why did they do that? Everybody asked me, well, why did they do that? We weren't able to pin that down. We need to get into the Continental Papers a little bit more and see if we can figure out exactly why they did it. So the things that I think happened are in italics. The one thing that I could prove is bolded, right? So it's pretty far away from Lancaster, right? So they wouldn't have any chance to influence their men. It's pretty far away from the current British forces, which are all still in Princeton, right? And these were going to be a potential exchange commodity, right? That kind of thing. Now, we do know that in Pennsylvania, it's just like today, nothing ever changes in America, right? So the people in Pennsylvania were complaining, hey, we can't take care of all these prisoners, right? And they started spreading them out themselves, like they ended up in Allentown, and they ended up in Lebanon County, right? They started spreading them out a little bit in order to, not burden Lancaster with the whole thing. 'Cause they already had a bunch of British prisoners there, and now they roll in with these, 1,000 Hessians, right? And they immediately said, well, we don't have the resources to guard these guys. Now, they'll be okay. They're not going to run off, right? And so we know that the Pennsylvania leaders complained to Congress, hey, we need some money. We need help doing this, and that kind of thing. Now, the other thing, Virginia was one of the more wealthy states, right? And they had not really been in scrap yet, right? Because they formed up some forces and they went and fought in Boston and Canada and whatever. But they were still a pretty wealthy state, right? There's no, we'd thrown the British out pretty early on, and so they could handle these prisoners. That's kind of what I assessed. I can't prove it yet. I got to go find that. But we do know that the Congress allocated, it was probably shillings, 533 shillings to help transport these guys. That would be really fun.
Until Dumfries was the county seat, and before Fairfax, everybody did their business in Dumfries.
Yeah.
And then Fairfax got their port with Alexandria, or I should say. But until that time, Dumfries was the second busiest port until New York.
Yeah, it's tobacco trade and everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
Until the harbor silted up.
Right.
absolutely. But until that time, Dumfries was a shipping port.
Yeah.
So it made sense to put them there.
It would have been bigger than New York.
Yeah.
Stretched it.
Of course, I always hear about from my mom's side of the family up in Long Island, Sag Harbor would have been larger than New York City, but if the whale oil trade had kept going.
So here we go. We're going to end up in Dumfries here, so they left Baltimore, went to Elbridge, Maryland. The Quaker Iron Works, they stayed there. The Quakers were smoked some German, right? So hung out with them. And then Plattsburgh, right, is actually, that's German. And kind of some Germans there. Georgetown was named after George. So they had to wait till the river froze over before they could cross the Potomac. And then they took a wrong turn up there in Colchester, right up there right north of the Occoquan. And then, so they ended up in Dumfries on January 25th. So they got here, and what did they find? Well, first of all, they were treated pretty well. Got rid of those bad Scotsmen, right? So the Scottish merchants that were running the port of Dumfries, any of those that were loyal to the king, they left. They evacuated. So there were some empty homes here, and that is what, maybe that was another reason why they sent them to Dumfries. There's some land out there. They were allowed to take jobs, work, start their own little economy, their own little business, so to speak. They were treated pretty civilly. So First Lieutenant Andreas Wiederholt, right, he had kept the diary, right, and his papers were left behind in Trenton when he got captured. So he asked Washington during that dinner meeting, hey, can I go back and get my papers? Well, Washington left him go back. He made 2 trips back across to Delaware to get his papers, and those papers, luckily, they survived, and we ended up benefiting from it here, many years later. He was highly respected by the other officers, and they said, hey, we need to get paid. So go to Lancaster and see if you can find the quartermaster and get us paid, which is kind of an interesting thing. By the way, the map that I'll show you later, he actually drew that map, so Dumfries was kind of cool. We did not put this in the original paper, and I'm like, well, this is great. Like, how did he get from point A? It's in the diary, so I recreated it, and so maybe on the 5th of February we can all go on a bus trip and retrace these steps. And anyway, he gets all the way through some of these German towns, and like little town, right? Peter, his name is Peter's little town, Peter, whatever, Jeremy, and, but anyway, he missed Mueller by 4 days. He was going to another camp to pay other prisoners. And so he came back to Dumfries, ran into some less than savory Americans, and almost got his life taken. And this American captain, Archibald Arms, stepped in and protected him. And so he basically escorted Weirholt back down to Georgetown, and from Georgetown he made his way back to Dumfries. And Lieutenant Mueller eventually showed up here at Dumfries, right? They stayed for 4 days, paid them, tried to brought up some new uniforms, and the biggest thing they needed were socks. Wear them out, right? Yeah. But anyway, so that's kind of neat. That's how the exchanges went. So life in Dumfries, as I said, the Scottish merchants, were here. They kind of left. And then, so they all, had different, had ways to like, hey, who owns this property? Well, nobody. Okay, so move in there and start taking care of it. And so Weirholt had pretty much free reign to go all over, Dumfries to walk around. They were allowed to go 3 or 4 miles outside of town and explore if they wanted to. And he recorded his experiences, about all the different kind of creatures and animals that he saw, and the kind of crops that were being grown, and the fruit trees, and he said he could already tell the soil was being overused, right? And this is, because he knew in Germany how you have to rotate the crops and all, and he could tell that wasn't happening here. It was burning out the soil. And of course, as somebody said, it washed away and went into the river.
Yeah. Well, also tobacco is pretty tough on us.
Yeah, he also made an interesting observation about the slaves, and he couldn't believe that, like, they weren't teaching them anything, they weren't educating them, they were mostly running around half naked. And so he said, this is no way to treat humans, even, because they were familiar with indentured servants, right? Indentured servants are like, hey, we brought you to America, and so you have to work. But they just thought the slavery thing was just kind of interesting. Not a way to treat your fellow man kind of thing. So, but anyway, so here's the map I had shown you originally. And what's amazing about this, these roads still exist, right? I tried to take a Google map and switch it and try and compare, but as an artillery officer, I've always studied maps. And it's amazing because this is, this road is clearly still there, right? The Boys and Girls Club is right here, and that's the split in the road, right? And then 234 comes in about right here, right? And then this bridge is still here. That bridge is still there. These were the piers and the warehouses down on the river, right? And we would store the goods there and then ship them out on the Quantico Creek. Is it Tony Creek? One, I can't remember. But anyway, so this is still here today, right? This section. And I tried to find the Williams Ordinary, right? But we'll have to maybe do some map swap. But yeah, it's interesting. The cemetery is here, right here. So yeah, these are. It's amazing that this stuff still exists. And now we're going to have a casino. So there you go. But yeah, it's kind of cool that he was able to do that. And dummy me, right? The people paying the bill. I didn't realize that they actually had this map on their website. I'm like, what? I looked at this potential Hessian prisoner of war camp, right? So that's like 5 minutes from my house, and so I went over there one day and started exploring and going, oh, maybe we should do some sort of archaeological dig here, see if we can find the remnants of this house. And there was mentioned in the diary where it says, hey, 4 of our officers were segregated from us and put out in the wilderness, and and they were put in this old ramshackle shack. I mean, he knew all about this and everything. So this is like one of these niches of niches of niches in history. And I was able to actually go there and say, I wonder if this is this flat spot right there by Powell's Creek, and you know, it looked pretty good to me. But yeah, if I was going to put up a little thing here by the creek, but a lot better place to do it, right? Interesting. US 1 is up there, right? The bridge across Powell's Creek, and Powell's Creek actually bends right here. It goes around and crosses over there. So this piece of flat ground might be something we can look at in the future. Yeah, Andreas also mentioned about the size of the leaves and how big these leaves were. He says, well, they're as big as a quattro piece of paper. And so I said, oh, okay, well, what is a quattro piece of paper? So I looked this up and figured out, you know, it's almost 8.5 by 11. It's 8 or something, not 8 3/4 by 11 1/4. So, anyway, so it was kind of interesting. So I found one of these leaves in my backyard and I put it on 8.5 by 11 paper. Just to give you an idea of, these leaves still exist today. We also talked about these small green frogs, and green frogs are pretty cool. I got them all over my backyard, and I found this one day on my light, looking up at my flag, and I decided to give him a name, so I called him Andres. And but he really is an American, right? Because he was looking at my flag. So, Mr. Button. So this is why I need a flag certificate from the SAR chapter, because I have my flag illuminated every night, right? So there you go. So my little buddy here, Andreas. So they were only there in Dumfries until September, and the reason they had to leave town was the British showed up at the head of the Elk, right, up in Maryland, with 15,000 troops, and they're like, okay, now what? And so they considered that Dumfries probably wasn't secure anymore, and they better move these prisoners, remember, because they're still a piece of property that we can exchange. And so they were moved out to Winchester, and picked up the story from there at some point with the Winchester guy. They eventually ended up in Fredericksburg from Winchester, and then from Fredericksburg they started getting exchanged. And and they were exchanged, a couple of months, and then most of them went back to Europe. A couple of them died of disease, and then one stayed behind in America, which is interesting. So a little statistical analysis: 26 officers. Remember, one went to Lancaster right after 27, and then there were 23 non-commissioned officers below. 36 were we had an age on. Well, you add them all together, it comes up to be about 27 and a half, which makes sense because mostly officers a little older, right, experience on that kind of thing. One young lad was with them, right? It's probably his son of one of the officers. And the oldest was 55. So kind of an interesting spread. 14 of them had said this was my job. This is the job I do in the unit. So that was identified on the Hessian prison list. So there you go. As we know, we've already used this information here in Dumfries for 2 things at least, and probably some more as we get ready to move towards the 250th anniversary of the revolution. So this will be something pretty early on, right? Pretty early on, right after the Declaration of Independence, the takedown of New York, and then the New Jersey campaign, the Canada campaign, and then Big O, Trenton, and then boom, right? This period of history comes pretty early on in the war. So be around to do that. Like I said, you're never done, right? Got to get up to Maryland, and I had planned to go to Germany this summer. We were going to do a reenactment with my unit, actually leaving Fortress Egenheim and filming it and everything, and then bring it back. But we're not in a position to raise the money we need to do that at this point. We're going to delay for a year or so to do that. But that'd be kind of fun. We film that, and we can actually show that as part of our question center.
Could you take about 90 seconds and tell me a little something about Ensign Fuhrer's time here in Dumfries? Was it a short life, or did he stay here a while?
Yeah, so he was here, there were two officers that were trying to like form a American-German brigade out of these prisoners, and they were trying to lobby Congress, and he was one of them, and that it just never came to be. They, even though the Continental Army was trying to get these guys to desert, well, here these guys were trying to say, hey, we'll form up a regiment for you out of these guys, right? And it just didn't happen. So he befriended a lot of Continentals, and then he ended up having a home here, and then he had his business in Wisconsin. And so he died in, I want to say, like 1790s.
Okay.
Yeah. And yeah.
Descendants? Any descendants, or was he a bachelor?
No, he never got married. So this was one of those things. So Lisa Timmerman and I are like, okay, she said, I think I know what this cemetery is. I think it's under 95. But we're waiting for the weather to clear. Kind of, she has a rough idea where it is, and so we're going to kind of do that. But she's got 4 JSHA journals in her collection down there. I'm going to give her a whole nother complete set. But the 4 she has, there's 2 of them in there. The Ken Jones articles. If you want to, go down there and borrow those and read them. They'll tell you all about yours. Kind of interesting guy. Other questions? Well, thank you for putting up with me. It's always fun to come out. This is about the 4th time I've done this.
And a follow-up, the cool angle that I would never have been aware of was the paymaster arriving to help the prisoners by giving them their British pay, basically, right? So he was traveling, what, under a flag of truce with some kind of parole commission or something?
Yeah, good question. So, the Continental Army would say, okay, where do you gotta go? And they would escort them to a crossover point. And then, like in Virginia, then the Virginia militia or somebody, local, would then escort them to another. So he was, escorted, and then, same way getting back. So it was a safe, it's a gentleman, right? I mean, warfare is not supposed to be.
And it was in our best interest if these guys could pay their own way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, for instance, Johannes, right? He not only did he get his Hessian pay, but he was being paid by this farmer. He was a farmhand for.
Cool. Like the guys during World War II.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, I was in West Germany, and this older gentleman was following me around. It's Cold War, right? So you're like, okay. So I just stopped and sat on a bench, and he came and sat aside of me. Turns out he was a Stuka navigator, enlisted navigator, shot down in Italy. He said, best thing that ever happened to me. I got captured by the Americans. He said, I ended up in prison camp in Texas. He said, we had more saltine crackers, Coca-Colas, and Hershey bars than we could handle. And he said, and then they took us out and we got paid to harvest wheat.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this was in 44. Yeah. Like
They have the best meals all day long. All they do is farm.
so you go to Fort Hood today, right? You can't stub your toe without running into a German restaurant. And that's still, that relationship's still there, right? American troops go there, American German women. So, yeah. And he ended up getting exchanged back to Germany with no jobs. He was actually a welder. This guy had helped build the Bismarck. And he showed me, he said, hey, look, he said, I used to go down the street every day, and the Bismarck was so big, it stuck out into the street. He said, this is cool, I could walk down it as a welder. So he got, because he had some technical skills, he put him in the Luftwaffe. And, but anyway, he couldn't find a job in Germany, so he asked permission to come to America, and got a job in steel mills in Pittsburgh. And he said to me, he says, Lieutenant Schwalm, I put both of my sons in the American Luftwaffe. So they were both Air Force guys. They got stationed in Germany. Who knew? Yeah, it's German Americans are still the largest single immigrant. By the way, the 1950 census is coming out, so we'll once again, all of us German Americans are going to go, yay, we're still the biggest from one single country. Last time I looked at it, it was somewhere around 43, 44 million. that big swath from like New Jersey to Ohio and all that. And then down into Texas and Cheryl Valley.
But you know, it's funny when you get ancestry.
Yes, oh,
Because
yeah.
my dad is the wife of the Hessian soldier, and very, very little German in my ancestry. My aunt's like, what? I'm like, well, think about it. He married a British woman. I'm sure his kids married British people. I mean, he must have married.
Right.
They didn't have German women over here.
Right. Yeah, I'm double tapped. I have a Prussian and a Hessian. So. Great grandfather fought at Second Manassas, right? John Kessler. You know, his parents came here from Prussia.